Hey everyone. Today we're tackling a question most textbooks bury in footnotes. What happens when the most powerful man in the ancient world discovers his only biological daughter has turned his moral crusade into a public joke? The princess was banished for excess of pleasure. The night Augustus felt ashamed of his own daughter. Forget the sanitized museum version. The real story involves political theater, weaponized gossip, and a father who literally rewrote Roman law to punish sexual behavior, then watched his own flesh and blood violate every single rule he'd carved into marble. Picture this, if you will. Torchlight flickering across marble columns, a sealed letter arriving at the Imperial palace, and the man who conquered the known world reading words that will destroy his family legacy. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, you need to understand who Augustus really was. Not the serene statue in a museum, but the calculating politician who built an empire on corpses and called it peace. Born Gaius Octavius in the year 63 before the Common Era, he was Julius Caesar's great-nephew and adopted heir. When Caesar was assassinated on the Ides of March in 44 BCE, this 18-year-old kid inherited a civil war, a broken republic, and a name that meant everything and nothing. He didn't inherit Caesar's military genius or charisma. What he had was something more dangerous: patience and an absolute willingness to do whatever it took. Over the next 13 years, he fought a civil war that killed hundreds of thousands, formed and broke alliances like they were party invitations, and gradually eliminated every rival who stood between him and absolute power. Mark Antony? Defeated at Actium in 31 BCE. The Roman Republic? Quietly strangled while everyone applauded the restoration of order. By 27 BCE, the Senate was begging him to accept the title Augustus, the revered one, and essentially unlimited power. But here's what's fascinating. Augustus understood something most dictators miss. You can seize power through violence, but you hold it through narrative. Rome had just endured a century of civil wars, political assassinations, and social chaos. People were exhausted. They wanted stability, tradition, respect for the old ways, even if those old ways were mostly invented. So Augustus gave them a story. He wasn't a king or a tyrant. He was the first citizen, the princeps, who had reluctantly accepted the burden of guiding Rome back to its ancient virtue. And virtus, dignitas, pietas, became his obsession. He rebuilt temples. He revived ancient religious festivals. He passed sweeping moral legislation designed to police Roman sexuality, marriage, and family life. The Lex Julia de Adulteriis Coercendis, passed around 18 BCE, made adultery a criminal offense for the first time in Roman history. Not a private family matter. A crime against the state. Women could be exiled, lose half their dowry, and be forbidden to remarry respectable citizens. Men faced similar penalties. This wasn't about morality in any personal sense. It was about control, about making private behavior a matter of public order. Now, and this is where it gets messy, Augustus had one biological child, Julia. Born in 39 BCE to his second wife, Scribonia, Julia entered the world during her father's rise to power, when every alliance mattered and every marriage was a political calculation. Augustus divorced Scribonia the day Julia was born, literally the same day, to marry Livia Drusilla, a woman from one of Rome's most distinguished families. Livia was already pregnant with another man's child when Augustus married her. Romantic? No. Strategic? Absolutely. Julia grew up in a household where her father was becoming a god. Literally, after his death, he would be deified, and where every aspect of her life was public property. She was brilliant, witty, well-educated in Greek and Latin literature, and according to multiple ancient sources, she understood exactly what role she was meant to play. The problem? She also understood that role was a prison. Here's what you need to grasp about elite Roman women's lives, especially imperial women. They had zero political power in any formal sense. Couldn't vote, couldn't hold office, couldn't inherit property in the same way men did. Their value was reproductive and symbolic. They produced heirs, preferably male, and embodied family honor. That's it. For Julia, daughter of Augustus, this meant her body wasn't her own. It was a political asset, to be deployed in service of her father's dynastic ambitions. And if you're enjoying history that actually examines how power worked instead of repeating the propaganda empires tell about themselves, go ahead and hit subscribe. We're just getting started with this story. Augustus married Julia off 3 times, and each marriage tells you everything about how he saw her. As a bargaining chip, a womb for producing heirs, a tool for binding potential rivals to his regime. Forget romance. Forget choice. This was statecraft conducted through bedrooms and birth canals. Her first husband was her cousin, Marcus Claudius Marcellus, son of Augustus's sister Octavia. She was 14. He was probably 17 or 18. The year was 25 BCE, and the marriage was designed to signal that Marcellus was Augustus's chosen heir. For 2 years, Julia played the role of dutiful wife. Then Marcellus died suddenly in 23 BCE, possibly from disease, possibly from plague. Ancient sources hint at foul play, but that's mostly conspiracy thinking. The relevant point: Julia was a widow at 16, childless, and immediately available for her father's next political arrangement. Husband number 2, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. If you don't know the name, you should. Agrippa was Augustus's closest friend, his best general, the man who actually won most of the military victories credited to the regime. He was also 25 years older than Julia, already married to Augustus's niece, and by all accounts completely uninterested in being a romantic husband. Augustus ordered him to divorce his current wife and marry Julia in 21 BCE. Agrippa obeyed. What else could he do? Here's where Julia's life becomes a baby production machine. Over the next decade, she gave birth to 5 children: Gaius, Lucius, Julia the Younger, Agrippina the Elder, and Agrippa Posthumus. 3 boys, 2 girls, all of them carrying Augustus's bloodline and serving his dynastic chess game. The 2 oldest boys, Gaius and Lucius, were immediately adopted by Augustus as his heirs. Think about that. Julia gave birth to them, but they legally became her brothers, raised in Augustus's household, groomed for power while she was, what? Expected to smile and produce more? Ancient biographers, writing decades later with their own agendas, report that Julia was witty and sharp-tongued even during this period. There's a famous anecdote. Someone asked her how her children all resembled Agrippa when she was known to have admirers. Her alleged response: "I never take on a passenger unless the ship is already full." It's a pregnancy joke, a double entendre about only taking lovers when she was already pregnant and couldn't conceive again. Whether she actually said it or whether it's later slander dressed as cleverness, the story reveals something. Rumors about Julia's private life were already circulating, already being weaponized. Agrippa died in 12 BCE. Julia was 27, a mother of 5, and once again available for her father's plans. By now, anyone paying attention could see the pattern. Augustus would marry her to his designated heir, bind that heir to the imperial family through marriage and children, and maintain control of the succession. The problem? His first 2 choices died. Marcellus, dead. Agrippa, dead. Who was left? Tiberius Claudius Nero, Livia's son from her first marriage. Augustus's stepson. Tiberius was one of Rome's best generals, a grim and competent military man who, by all accounts, had no interest in being anyone's spare heir. He was happily married to Vipsania Agrippa, Agrippa's daughter from an earlier marriage. They had a son. By every indication, Tiberius loved her. Doesn't matter. Augustus ordered Tiberius to divorce Vipsania and marry Julia in 11 BCE. Ancient sources preserve a heartbreaking detail. Tiberius saw Vipsania once on the street after the divorce and followed her with tears streaming down his face, looking so devastated that measures were taken to ensure they never crossed paths again. Then he went home and married Julia, the woman he would come to resent as a living symbol of everything stolen from him. This marriage was doomed from the start. Tiberius was dour, rigid, obsessed with military discipline and traditional values, essentially a younger, grimmer version of Augustus himself. Julia was now in her late 20s, had spent 15 years being passed between husbands like property, and had buried 2 of them. If the ancient sources are even partly reliable, she was done performing dutiful gratitude. This section discusses historical allegations about private life in antiquity, no graphic detail, focus on political implications and source bias. So what exactly did Julia do that caused Augustus to banish his only daughter, invoke his own adultery laws, and publicly shame the imperial family? According to ancient sources, particularly Seneca the Younger, Pliny the Elder, Tacitus, and Cassius Dio, all writing decades to centuries after the events, Julia engaged in a series of affairs with prominent Roman nobles. The allegations include public sexual behavior, parties in the forum itself, and deliberate mockery of her father's moral legislation. Let's be clear about something. We don't have Julia's side of the story. We don't have trial transcripts, testimony from neutral witnesses, or anything approaching what we'd call evidence today. What we have is politically motivated gossip, recorded by male writers who supported Augustus's regime, filtered through layers of moral judgment and literary convention. When Seneca writes about Julia, he's using her as a rhetorical example of female excess. When Tacitus mentions her, it's in the context of imperial family dysfunction as a cautionary tale. These aren't journalists. They're propagandists and moralists with axes to grind. That said, even propaganda can reveal patterns. The consistent thread through all accounts. Julia was accused of adultery with multiple partners, including Iulus Antonius, son of Mark Antony and Fulvia, Augustus's old enemy. Think about the symbolism there. The daughter of Augustus sleeping with the son of Antony. Whether true or exaggerated, that accusation carries massive political weight. It's not just personal betrayal. It's a symbolic reversal of everything Augustus fought for, everything his propaganda claimed to represent. Ancient sources, often hostile and written decades later, allege that Julia held nighttime gatherings in the Forum, specifically near the Rostra, the speaker's platform where Augustus himself gave speeches about moral reform. They claim she used the Forum as a location for meeting lovers, that she wore garlands and behaved in ways that mocked her father's legislation. Cassius Dio, writing in the early 3rd century CE, more than 200 years after these events, reports that Julia committed adultery with many men, and that she did so openly, as if challenging her father's authority. Modern scholars treat these claims with significant skepticism. Why? Because they fit too perfectly into existing literary stereotypes about elite women who transgress boundaries. Bad women in Roman literature always do the same things. They're sexually promiscuous, they're associated with public spaces they shouldn't occupy, they corrupt men around them, they bring shame to their families. It's a template, a script for female villainy. Does that mean Julia did nothing wrong? Not necessarily. Does it mean we should accept these accounts as straightforward fact? Absolutely not. Here's what we can say with more confidence. By 2 BCE, when Julia was 37, something happened that caused Augustus to invoke his own adultery laws against her. He didn't just divorce her from Tiberius, he used his power as pater familias, the absolute authority of the Roman father, to declare her guilty of adultery and order her exile. No trial, no defense, no chance for her to speak in her own defense. He wrote to the Senate, had the letter read aloud, and announced his own daughter's disgrace to the entire Roman world. The letter's contents don't survive, but ancient historians summarize its impact. Augustus admitted his daughter had violated the very laws he'd imposed on everyone else. He couldn't show mercy without undermining the entire moral program that justified his authority. His propaganda claimed Rome was being restored to virtue through his family's example, and now his family was the scandal. The personal shame was intolerable, but the political problem was worse. How do you claim moral authority to regulate everyone else's sexuality when your own daughter is accused of turning the Forum into a party venue? Augustus chose spectacle. He exiled Julia to Pandateria, a tiny volcanic island off the coast of Campania, roughly the size of a few city blocks. No men were allowed on the island except by special permission. No wine, no luxuries. Her mother, Scribonia, divorced decades earlier, voluntarily accompanied her into exile. Julia went from being the emperor's daughter, the mother of his designated heirs, the center of imperial court life, to a prisoner on a rock in the Mediterranean. Now let's talk about the men. Because Augustus didn't just exile Julia, he destroyed everyone allegedly connected to her. This is where the story stops being about sex and becomes about political purges dressed up as moral outrage. Iulus Antonius, the most prominent name among Julia's alleged lovers, was the son of Mark Antony and Fulvia. After Antony's defeat and suicide following Actium, Augustus had adopted several of Antony's children, including Iulus, raising them in his household alongside Julia. In other words, they grew up together. Iulus went on to have a successful career. He was consul, he held priesthoods, he wrote poetry. By all accounts, he was integrated into the Augustan establishment. Then came the accusations. Ancient sources allege Iulus was not just Julia's lover, but the ringleader of a broader conspiracy. Some accounts suggest the adultery charges were cover for something more dangerous: political plotting, discussion of regime change, whispers about alternatives to Augustus's planned succession. Whether any of this was real or manufactured, the result was the same. Iulus Antonius was forced to commit suicide. Augustus gave him the choice: die by your own hand with some dignity, or face execution as a traitor. Iulus chose the blade. Others named in connection with Julia included Appius Claudius Pulcher, Sempronius Gracchus, and several other nobles whose names appear in fragmentary sources. Most were exiled. Some disappear from the historical record entirely, which in Roman terms often means they died quietly and no one bothered to memorialize them. Sempronius Gracchus, allegedly one of Julia's lovers, was exiled to Cercina, an island off North Africa, and was later executed on Tiberius's orders after Augustus died. Here's the thing: the charges against these men weren't just adultery. Roman law treated male adultery seriously under Augustus's legislation, but it rarely resulted in death or permanent exile unless other crimes were involved. The severity of the punishment suggests Augustus believed, or wanted everyone to believe, that something more threatening was happening. Political conspiracy? Plans to challenge the succession? Or simply the need to make an example so brutal that no one would dare question his authority again? Think about the timing. By 2 BCE, Augustus's succession plans were fragile. His two adopted sons, Gaius and Lucius, Julia's biological children, were being groomed for power. But they were young, untested. Tiberius, the dutiful but resentful stepson, had actually retired from public life in 6 BCE, withdrawing to Rhodes in what looked like a voluntary exile. The imperial family was fractured, the succession uncertain, and now the emperor's daughter was accused of behavior that made a mockery of everything the regime claimed to stand for. Was Julia guilty of the specific acts described in ancient sources? We can't know. Was she guilty of something Augustus and his advisors considered dangerous enough to warrant her destruction? Almost certainly. But dangerous in Roman imperial politics doesn't necessarily mean criminal in any modern sense. It might mean she had her own political network, her own loyalties, her own ideas about who should wield power. It might mean she spoke too freely, entertained the wrong visitors, cultivated relationships that threatened Augustus's carefully managed succession. In an autocracy, independence is treason. What's striking is how total her erasure was meant to be. Augustus didn't just exile Julia. He forbade her to drink wine, banned men from visiting her, restricted her movements to a tiny island, and explicitly stated she should never be buried in his mausoleum. He erased her from the succession as if she'd never existed. Her children by Agrippa remained in his care, but Julia herself became a non-person, a cautionary tale, a symbol of what happens when imperial women step out of line. The cruelty is personal, but the message is political. No one, not even the emperor's own blood, is exempt from his judgment. Augustus had spent decades arguing that his power was legitimate because he embodied virtue and tradition. Julia's alleged behavior threatened that legitimacy, so she had to be punished in a way that proved his commitment to his own laws was stronger than fatherly love. Whether he believed the charges, whether they were exaggerated, whether they were partly fabricated, it almost doesn't matter. She became the sacrifice that preserved the system. You might be wondering, where was Tiberius during all this? Great question, because his role in Julia's downfall tells you everything about their marriage and his character. Short answer, he was conveniently absent, and when he finally returned, he made sure everyone knew he'd predicted this disaster. Remember, Tiberius had withdrawn to Rhodes in 6 BCE, claiming he wanted to retire from public life. Ancient historians debate his real motives. Some say he was exhausted by military campaigns. Others suggest he was fed up with being Augustus's backup plan, always second choice, never trusted with real power. Still others hint he simply couldn't stand being married to Julia, that the marriage was so toxic he chose exile over enduring it. Whatever his reasons, Tiberius spent the next several years on Rhodes, studying philosophy and rhetoric, pretending he was just a private citizen. Except he wasn't. He was still Augustus's stepson, still married to Julia, still technically part of the imperial succession, just refusing to play his assigned role. This drove Augustus insane. The emperor sent increasingly angry letters demanding Tiberius return. Tiberius refused. Then Julia's scandal broke. Ancient sources preserve a detail that's almost too perfect. When news of Julia's exile reached Rhodes, Tiberius immediately wrote to Augustus advocating for clemency. He urged his stepfather to show mercy, to allow Julia some comforts in exile, to soften the punishment. On the surface, this looks like decency. Look closer, and it's calculation. By publicly pleading for leniency he knew Augustus would refuse, Tiberius positioned himself as the virtuous, forgiving husband, while ensuring everyone remembered he distanced himself from Julia years earlier. He was protecting his own reputation. It worked. By 2 CE, Augustus was desperate. Gaius Caesar, one of his adopted heirs, had been wounded fighting in Armenia and died. Lucius Caesar had died 2 years earlier from illness. In the space of 18 months, both of Augustus's chosen successors were dead, leaving him with no clear heir except the one person he'd been trying to avoid, Tiberius. The grim, resentful, withdrawn stepson who'd refused to cooperate became the only viable option. Augustus recalled Tiberius from Rhodes and formally adopted him as his son and heir, with the condition that Tiberius immediately adopt Germanicus, the son of Tiberius's brother, ensuring the succession would eventually pass to someone with Julian blood. Even at the moment of triumph, Augustus couldn't quite trust Tiberius, couldn't quite forget that this was his last choice, the fallback plan, the heir he was stuck with. And Julia? Still on her island. Still banned from Rome. Augustus did eventually move her from Pandateria to Rhegium on the Italian mainland. A slightly less harsh exile, but still complete isolation from court life, from her children, from any meaningful existence. She lived on imperial allowance, which Augustus carefully regulated, making sure she had enough to survive, but nothing resembling her former status. The truly vicious detail: when Augustus died in 14 CE, Tiberius became emperor, and one of his first acts was to cut off Julia's allowance. He stopped the food shipments, the money, everything. Ancient sources report that Julia slowly starved to death, wasting away in exile while her former husband ruled the empire. Whether Tiberius actively intended to kill her through neglect or simply didn't care if she lived or died, the result was the same. She died sometime around 14 or 15 CE, after roughly 15 years in exile, and was not buried in the family mausoleum as Augustus had explicitly ordered. Think about the symbolism. The emperor's only daughter, the woman who gave birth to his heirs, the living link to his bloodline, left to die alone on the Italian coast while being systematically erased from family memory. No funeral honors, no public mourning, no acknowledgement that she'd ever mattered. So here's the question we've been circling. Did Julia actually do what she was accused of? Or was she the victim of a political purge disguised as moral outrage? And honestly, the answer is probably both, which is what makes this story so revealing about how power actually works. Let's start with the simplest possibility. Julia had affairs. Given the circumstances of her life, married off at 14, widowed twice, married a third time to a man who clearly resented her, spent 15 years producing heirs with no autonomy over her own body, would it be surprising if she sought emotional or physical connection elsewhere? Roman elite women, especially those at the highest levels of society, lived under constant surveillance, but also had certain freedoms within domestic space. They hosted salons, cultivated intellectual circles, maintained networks of clients and allies. If Julia used that space to conduct relationships Augustus disapproved of, that's plausible. But here's where it gets complicated. The specific allegations seem designed to humiliate Augustus in the most public way possible. Meeting lovers in the Forum, at the rostra where Augustus gave speeches, wearing garlands and staging what amounts to a public spectacle. That's not just adultery, that's theater. That's someone either incredibly reckless or someone making a deliberate political statement. Or, and this is more likely, that's how hostile sources chose to portray her behavior decades after the fact, turning whatever actually happened into the most scandalous version possible. Think about how rumors work in authoritarian regimes. When a leader's family member falls from grace, the official story always makes them as guilty as possible. Admitting that the charges might be exaggerated or that the punishment might be disproportionate would undermine the leader's judgment. Better to paint the accused as not just wrong, but spectacularly, undeniably, almost cartoonishly guilty. That way the severity of the punishment seems justified, even merciful. What if Julia wasn't having affairs at all? What if she was doing something Augustus considered equally dangerous, building her own political network, cultivating loyalty to her sons rather than to Augustus himself, preparing for a future where she, as the mother of the emperors, would wield influence? Roman history is full of powerful mothers using their sons' authority to exercise indirect power, Livia being the most obvious example. If Julia was attempting something similar, Augustus would have seen it as a threat to his control over the succession. Or consider this scenario. Julia's alleged lovers were Augustus's political enemies or rivals, men he wanted to eliminate but couldn't touch without evidence of actual conspiracy. Accusing them of adultery with the emperor's daughter accomplishes several goals at once. It destroys them personally and politically. It reinforces Augustus's moral legislation by showing that even the elite face consequences, and it removes Julia as a potential focal point for opposition, ensuring she can never be used against him. The detail about Iulus Antonius is especially telling. The son of Mark Antony, raised in Augustus's household, allegedly sleeping with Augustus's daughter. That's almost too symbolic to be coincidental. It reads like propaganda, like someone constructed the perfect narrative to justify eliminating the last significant descendant of Augustus's greatest enemy. Whether Iulus and Julia were actually lovers, whether their relationship was political rather than sexual, whether the entire story was fabricated, any of these possibilities serves Augustus's interests. Here's what we know for certain. Augustus used the accusation of adultery as a weapon to destroy his daughter and eliminate several prominent nobles in a single purge. He leveraged his own moral legislation to justify what was essentially an autocratic exercise of power. And he did it in a way that made him look principled rather than tyrannical. A father forced to choose law over love. A leader who wouldn't compromise his values even for his own flesh and blood. That's the genius of it in a horrifying way. By publicly shaming Julia and himself, by admitting his family had failed to live up to the standards he imposed on everyone else, Augustus turned a potential scandal into proof of his integrity. "Look how principled I am," the narrative says. "I punish my own daughter." Who can accuse me of hypocrisy now? Tell me in the comments. Do you think Julia was actually guilty of what she was accused of? Or was this just politics dressed up as morality? Because honestly, the more you look at the evidence, the murkier it gets. Except the whole system was hypocritical. Augustus's moral legislation wasn't about protecting women or strengthening families or restoring virtue. It was about control. Control over who could marry whom, who could inherit, how people could arrange their private lives. The laws gave the state unprecedented power to intervene in domestic matters, turning private behavior into public crime. Julia's exile was the logical conclusion of that system. Even the emperor's daughter wasn't exempt from surveillance, judgment, and punishment. Let's zoom out for a moment and talk about why Julia's story matters beyond ancient gossip. Because this pattern, powerful men policing women's sexuality while claiming it's about virtue, family values, or social order, doesn't exactly stay in antiquity, does it? Augustus's moral legislation, the laws that criminalized adultery and regulated marriage, weren't passed in a vacuum. They came after decades of civil war, when Rome's traditional social structures had been shattered. Elite families had been destroyed, wealth had changed hands violently, and women, especially widows, had inherited unprecedented amounts of property. The old republic had informal mechanisms for controlling women's behavior through family pressure and social shame. But in the chaos of the late republic and early empire, those mechanisms broke down. So Augustus turned private behavior into public law. The Lex Julia de Adulterius made adultery a crime that could be prosecuted by anyone, not just the offended husband. It gave the state, meaning Augustus, the power to intervene in marriages, to punish women for sexual behavior outside approved relationships, to regulate who could marry whom and who could inherit from whom. Wrapped in the language of tradition and virtue, it was actually a radical expansion of state power into areas previously considered family matters. And it worked, at least as a tool of control. Elite Romans understood that their private lives were now subject to political scrutiny, that sexual behavior could be weaponized against them, that the emperor could invoke these laws to destroy anyone who threatened him. Julia's exile was the clearest possible demonstration. Not even imperial blood protects you if you challenge the emperor's authority. Now think about how this plays out across history. How many women have been destroyed through accusations about their sexual behavior when the real issue was their political influence, their independence, or their refusal to play assigned roles? How many times has morality been the excuse for silencing women who threatened male power structures? Julia's story is ancient, but the mechanics are depressingly familiar. The double standard is baked into the system. Augustus himself almost certainly had affairs. Ancient sources hint at relationships throughout his life, including a famous liaison with Terentia, the wife of Maecenas, one of his closest advisors. No one prosecuted him. No one exiled him to an island. The moral legislation applied to everyone else but somehow never touched the emperor himself. That's how power works. The rules bind other people, not the person who makes them. Julia understood this. Her alleged quote about only taking passengers when the ship was full, whether she actually said it or not, reveals a sharp awareness of the double standard. She knew her father was policing everyone else's behavior while exempting himself. She knew the moral crusade was performance, propaganda, control disguised as virtue. And if she did violate her father's laws, it's at least possible she was doing so consciously, as a form of resistance, a way of saying, "You don't own me completely. You can't control every aspect of my life. I am more than the role you've assigned me." Or maybe she was just trying to find some joy, some connection, some autonomy in a life where she'd been treated as property since childhood. Maybe she wasn't making a political statement at all. Maybe she was just being human in a system that demanded she be a symbol. The final years of Julia's life are almost too bleak to contemplate. 15 years in exile, 15 years separated from her children, from any meaningful social contact from the world she'd been raised to inhabit. Her sons, Gaius and Lucius, both died before she did, so she never saw them take power, never witnessed the dynasty she'd been forced to create come to fruition. Her daughter Julia the Younger was later exiled on similar adultery charges, the same playbook, the same weapon, used against the next generation. Ancient sources preserve a few details about Julia's exile that are particularly grim. Tacitus mentions that she was not allowed to drink wine or enjoy any luxury. Suetonius reports that Augustus rejected all pleas for clemency, even from prominent citizens who argued that her punishment was excessive. When someone suggested Julia's exile should be softened, Augustus allegedly replied, "May the gods curse you with daughters and wives like mine." That's not just anger. That's a complete rejection of paternal feeling, a public statement that he valued his political image over his own child. The allowance cut off by Tiberius is the final cruelty. Julia died slowly, probably from malnutrition or disease exacerbated by poor conditions and lack of resources. No sources record her last words, her thoughts, her perspective on the life she'd lived. She exists in the historical record only as an object. Daughter of Augustus, wife of 3 men, mother of heirs, cautionary tale of female transgression. Her voice, her interiority, her own understanding of what happened and why, all of it was erased as thoroughly as her name from the family tomb. But here's what survives. The questions her story raises about power, control, and who gets to tell the narrative. We call this the night Augustus felt ashamed of his own daughter. But that framing assumes Augustus's shame was the important element. What about Julia's shame? What about her rage, her grief, her exhaustion at being used as a political tool for 40 years before being destroyed the moment she became inconvenient? The historical sources don't care about those questions because they were written by men in a patriarchal society that saw Julia's punishment as appropriate, even necessary. They present Augustus as tragic figure, forced to choose between love and duty, when a more accurate reading might see him as a tyrant who destroyed his daughter to protect his own power. The excess of pleasure in the title is how ancient sources framed her behavior, but that framing is itself political. Pleasure, autonomy, desire, these become excess only when women claim them in a system designed to deny them those things. What would the story look like if Julia wrote it? We'll never know. The closest we get are those witty quotations preserved in ancient texts, used as evidence of her shamelessness, but revealing, if you read them generously, a sharp intelligence, a dark humor, an awareness that she was living in a world rigged against her. She joked about her predicament because what else could she do? She couldn't change the system. She couldn't escape her father's power. So she laughed at it, mocked it, maybe even deliberately violated it, knowing the consequences, knowing she'd lose, but refusing to be entirely owned. So what's the answer? Did Julia commit the acts she was accused of, or was she the victim of a political purge? The honest answer, probably something in between, and we'll never know the full truth because the only versions we have were written by people who needed her to be guilty. What we can say with confidence, Augustus weaponized morality. He passed laws that gave him unprecedented power to police private behavior, then used those laws to eliminate his own daughter and anyone associated with her when they became politically inconvenient or personally embarrassing. Whether Julia was guilty of adultery, political conspiracy, or simply living as an autonomous person in a system that couldn't tolerate female autonomy, the result was the same. She was destroyed. The night Augustus felt ashamed from the title probably refers to the moment he read whatever reports or accusations triggered the exile decree. Ancient sources paint it as a moment of profound personal anguish, the emperor forced to choose between fatherly love and moral principle. But that framing obscures the more important question. What kind of system creates that choice in the first place? What kind of father builds a power structure that requires him to destroy his own child? Augustus spent his entire reign constructing a narrative about himself as the restorer of Roman virtue, the bringer of peace and moral order after a century of chaos. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, was his greatest achievement and his most effective propaganda. But that peace was built on surveillance, control, and the systematic elimination of anyone who threatened his authority. Julia's exile wasn't an aberration. It was the system working exactly as designed. Her story reveals the cost of that peace. Behind the marble temples and the moral legislation and the carefully cultivated image of the father of the nation, there was a man willing to let his daughter die in exile rather than admit his system was flawed. There was an empire held together not by virtue but by fear, where even imperial blood couldn't protect you from the emperor's judgment, where private behavior became evidence in political prosecutions, where women's bodies were state property to be deployed and then discarded. The excess of pleasure Julia allegedly indulged in was, in the end, probably just the desire to be treated as a human being rather than as a political asset. The scandal wasn't that she had affairs, it's that she claimed some small measure of autonomy in a world that demanded her complete submission. And for that, she paid with 15 years of exile and a lonely death, while her father became a god and her memory became a cautionary tale about what happens to women who step out of line. Let's bring this home with one final observation. Julia's story keeps repeating because the underlying power dynamics keep repeating. Every time a political regime claims to defend traditional values or restore morality or protect the family, look closely at what they're actually doing. More often than not, they're expanding state power into private life, turning personal behavior into political crime, and creating mechanisms that can be used to destroy anyone who challenges them. Augustus didn't pass moral legislation because he genuinely believed adultery was destroying Rome. He passed it because it gave him a tool for control, a way to bind elite families to his regime, and a weapon to use against anyone who threatened his power. The law appeared to apply to everyone, but in practice it applied to his enemies and his daughter while leaving him untouched. That's not morality, that's politics. And Julia? She was brilliant, witty, educated, and trapped. Born into a family where her only value was reproductive, married off repeatedly to men she didn't choose, expected to perform virtue while everyone around her understood the entire system was a performance. If she violated her father's laws, it was probably because those laws were unlivable, designed to control rather than to protect, tools of oppression dressed up as tradition. The night Augustus felt ashamed, if that night even existed as a single dramatic moment rather than a gradual realization of political necessity, was the night he chose power over humanity. He chose his image, his regime, his moral crusade over his own child, and the system he built made that choice inevitable, even heroic in the eyes of his supporters. That's the real scandal. Not Julia's alleged behavior, but the fact that a father destroying his daughter could be framed as virtue. We don't know what Julia thought during her years of exile. We don't know if she regretted whatever actions led to her banishment, if she was angry, if she found any peace or meaning in her isolation. The historical record doesn't care about her internal life. She exists only as an object lesson, a warning, a supporting character in her father's story. But standing here, more than 2,000 years later, we can at least ask different questions. We can refuse to accept the narrative that her destruction was necessary or justified. We can recognize that the shame in this story doesn't belong to Julia, who was trying to be human in an inhuman system, but to Augustus, who built that system and enforced it with absolute power. We can see the excess of pleasure accusation for what it was, a political charge dressed up in moral language, a tool of control, a way of erasing a woman who had become inconvenient. The princess was banished for excess of pleasure, but the real excess was the emperor's power, the autocratic system that could destroy anyone, even imperial family members, with no trial, no defense, no chance to speak in their own voice. That system lasted for centuries. It influenced legal codes throughout Europe. Elements of it persist today whenever governments claim the authority to regulate private behavior in the name of morality, tradition, or social order. Julia died alone, erased from her family's tomb, starved by the man she was forced to marry, remembered only through the words of men who needed her to be guilty. But her story survives as evidence of what power does when it wraps itself in virtue. It destroys, it silences. It calls that destruction justice and expects us to applaud. So the next time someone invokes traditional values or moral restoration or family honor as justification for controlling other people's lives, remember Julia. Remember that those words have been used to destroy people for millennia. Remember that the person claiming to defend morality is often just defending their own power. And remember that the people who pay the price are usually the ones with the least ability to tell their own stories. Augustus built an empire. Julia became its most intimate casualty. That's the story. That's what happened the night the emperor felt ashamed of his daughter. He chose empire over humanity, control over love, and the world praised him for it. The shame is ours if we keep falling for the same trick. If this kind of historical analysis, the kind that looks at how power actually operates instead of repeating the myths empires tell about themselves, resonates with you, subscribe and drop a like. There are centuries more of these stories to unpack, and trust me, the patterns just keep repeating.